Okay, hello. This is Julian again with Straight from a Scientist podcast. We're here with Daniel, who's doing his PhD in Berkeley right now. What's up, Daniel?
Hello, it's me. I'm Daniel Toker. I'm doing a neuroscience PhD at Berkeley, where I study how information flows along large brain networks and how that is related to um, brain state and perception.
Brain state and perception. Now, how did you get into this field? This is quite a specific field.
Yeah, so I think we got to go way back to when I was about 15. Uh, it's when it first dawned on me that the brain is this physical thing that somehow gives rise to the mind. And it's like a very basic realization, but like the full force of it really struck me. And I was just obsessed with this mystery, like how could the brain possibly give rise to the mind for years. And for a while, I was kind of obsessed with like the philosophical aspect of this question. But when I got to college, I discovered science after reading Carl Sagan's Cosmos, and that inspired me to become a neuroscientist. And through that, I began investigating these questions, which kind of they seem niche, but I think they help us understand these kind of bigger questions of how the brain can give rise to the conscious mind.
Yeah, and what, before we get into deep, what is consciousness for you? I mean, consciousness, we don't really know. When you hear consciousness, it's really difficult to describe. Is it a biological thing? Is it local consciousness, or what are we?
So, I mean, I used to care a lot about these like subtle philosophical definitions, but I've kind of decided to stop caring about how to define it, just because I think it's difficult to get a really rigorous philosophical definition before we get some of the scientific basics down. So what you can do is you can approach it kind of brute force at first and just say, okay, what's changing in the brain when we lose consciousness? Is there common to all states of unconsciousness, and what does that tell us? Can we look at what the brain is doing when you perceive something consciously versus when you don't? And once we begin to flesh out these scientific details, I think we can start to refine our more philosophical concepts.
Exactly. Interesting. Yeah, you brought up a really good point. See what changes when we lose consciousness as a way to kind of figure out what is going on or what. So when you say lose consciousness, are you talking about sleep? Are you talking about anesthesia? Or even like a knockout punch, or what? All these things.
Right. So really anything. Right now I'm focusing on anesthesia, but you could look at anesthesia, deep sleep. So when we're asleep, for example, and we're dreaming, the brain actually looks pretty much awake, but you're paralyzed. Whereas the slow wave sleep, which is the deepest stage of sleep, that looks a lot like anesthesia. Anesthesia is basically like a more there's some subtle differences, but it's essentially a stable form of deep sleep. There are also things like absence seizures. So a certain kind of seizure that makes someone lose consciousness.
Yeah, I've seen those. Yeah.
And it turns out there's actually a few very striking similarities across all these states of unconsciousness, which tells us something, that even though the way the brain generates these different states is very different, that how the brain ends up in these states is very similar. And if we can figure out what that similarity is, then we'll be in a better position to understand what makes the brain conscious versus not.
Exactly. Very interesting. Now, what are the changes from a conscious brain to a unconscious?
So the main one, it's the most obvious, I think, if you put an EEG on someone. So an EEG is just put electrodes over the scalp. You can also do what's called ECOG, which is essentially EEG electrodes but on the brain itself. So if you have some patient in the hospital who is about to get brain surgery, if they have epilepsy, for example, typically the neurosurgeon will place electrodes on their brain, sometimes inside their brain as well. And they're just sitting around there for about a week waiting for the seizure.
Yeah.
And when it hits, the surgeon can look at the recordings and the electrodes and localize where it's coming from, and then they can remove that part of the brain. But in the meantime, as neuroscientists, we can come in, give them tasks, for example, give them some behavioral task and see how that affects their brain activity. Or at a more simple level, I can ask what's changing in their brain when they're asleep or when they're anesthetized, when they're about to get surgery. So we have all that data. So what you'll see in these signals, when someone is awake, you have a lot of low amplitude, high frequency activity. Whereas when they're in deep sleep or anesthetized, you start getting these much bigger and slower oscillations. So it basically looks like the difference between noise and this like simple sine wave.
Mm-hmm.
And you get these big slow. So go ahead.
No, go for it. No, I was gonna say that the waves slow down when you're sleeping, is what you're saying.
Yeah, it's bound to get bigger.
Now, but what are the waves? So the EEG measures electrical activity, and the other one you said ECOG, was that it?
Yeah, ECOG.
ECOG. Okay, I was gonna just quickly say for our listeners that the EEG is great because you can just put it on any person pretty much. But the problem is that the signal has to travel through the meninges. I was thinking in Spanish there, meninges, the meninges and the scalp. So you actually, it's a different signal.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, you lose a lot of information when it makes its way through the skull, and you also with EEG you don't know where the signal's coming from the brain. It's hard to localize.
Yeah.
Whereas EEG, you're getting it right from the source.
Which is excellent. Nice. So I didn't know. That's great that you have access to that. So you're saying these epileptic patients, they have the ECOG for 1 week during.
It really depends. It could be a day or a week. Because you're basically
their scalps are opened for like
They're
1
open.
week. That is, I haven't heard that.
Yeah, and they're basically just waiting for a seizure in the hospital. So yeah, but what's interesting is that you can still see this slowing activity in EEG or in ECOG. It's such a strong effect they can get it farther. And what's interesting is that you see these slow, strong waves of electric activity for any state of unconsciousness. You get it in coma, you get it in anesthesia, you get it for deep sleep, and you get it in seizures, which tells us that there's something here. Like if we can understand why this causes unconsciousness, I think we'd be in a better position to understand how the brain creates the conscious state.
Yeah. So now I know that there's certain neurotransmitters and things that are related to wakefulness or unconscious. Now, could these be playing? These are definitely playing a role, but what role do they exactly play? So I know adenosine is one that plays sleep. Am I?
Yeah. So adenosine. This is actually.
This is how coffee works, right? Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, which I'm drinking right now. Caffeine basically just blocks adenosine receptors. And I don't know the full circuit of that, but when the adenosine binds these receptors, it's part of the making you tired signal cascade.
Yeah. So you're blocking the receptors and basically tired as fast. Exactly.
Although I think I don't know too much about the neuroscience of coffee, but I think what happens is the adenosine just kind of builds up in between synapses, and when the caffeine gets unbound, then you just get a flood of adenosine, which is why you get knocked out.
Yeah. Or when you wake up, if you're addicted like I am, and you don't drink it, and you just have the pounding headache.
I think there's also there's an important difference between cellular energy and then what your brain is telling you about how much energy you have or not.
Yeah, that's true too.
Right? I mean, for example, there are certain drugs like caffeine, which can make you feel like you have a lot of energy, even if you actually don't.
Yeah, so it's like a trick. But but here's the thing: if you feel like you have a lot of energy, you have a lot of energy, right?
Yeah, exactly. Well, see, I guess subjective energy is different from cellular CP energy.
We're getting deep into the consciousness now. So what are the current theories of consciousness? What are the scientists saying nowadays?
So it's kind of an interesting question because there are theories out there and they all relate, but they've all been kind of resistant to empirical testing for a number of reasons. but there's one theory I like. I'm not married to it. I think it has some interesting intuitions that I want to explore. This is the integrated information theory of consciousness, which was proposed by Giulio Tononi at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And this central intuition of the theory, which I actually find quite appealing, is to start from thinking about the phenomenology of consciousness, like thinking about, okay, like what does it mean for me to be conscious, and then try to move from there to what kind of neural mechanisms could be driving it. And I think that the most important intuition behind the theory is that consciousness is literally information rich, in the sense that, like, right now you're hearing my voice, and we're Skyping, so you can see me. In the mathematical sense, your perception is full of information. Like, we can't quantify it, but there's some number of bits of information that are being carried by your perception right now. So that's one thing. And then we can say, okay, so somewhere in the brain there are neural mechanisms that are carrying the same information, and maybe there's some kind of link there. And the other, I think, more unique intuition about this theory is that it's integrated. So you can't perceive my voice right now separately from your visual perception of me, or the tactile perception of the chair that you're sitting on. It's all somehow being integrated to make your field of consciousness. And so the intuition is, maybe what's important here is to study sensory information and how they can be integrated together. And that inspired some work in mathematics, which was what I started my PhD working on. How do you quantify the integration of information from this canonical information theoretic perspective? And does that then tell us anything about consciousness? The jury is still very much out on that question, but very cool math has been developed to answer this question.
That's awesome. So you're using mathematical models to deal with this?
Yeah, so there's, information theory has been around for about 60 years, and it's gorgeous, elegant mathematical framework for quantifying communication. So you can say, let's say I have two neurons communicating to one another. Can I measure their signals, and then based on that, infer how many bits of information are getting transmitted between them? Exactly. So that framework has been around forever, but it was designed for engineering purposes where you want one thing to talk to another. So, one telephone receiver to talk, or one sender to talk to one receiver. And that's been extremely useful in neuroscience historically. So if you look at, for example, like visual perception, a lot of it, the first stages is very feedforward. So the retina sends information to the thalamus sends information to your primary visual cortex. And people have used classic information theory to study these transmission mechanisms for decades, and it's been extraordinarily useful, and we've learned a lot from it. The problem is that once you get past your primary visual cortex, everything becomes this extraordinary, complicated network. You can't really talk about, A sending a message to B anymore. It's more like A sending a message to B, which is also sending a message to C, which is also talking back to A, which is talking back to D, which is also talking to C.
Yeah, exactly.
Right? Classic information theory was just not up to the task of quantifying information flow in these big networks. And what's interesting is that these ideas about consciousness led people to develop mathematics for studying information integration in large networks. They were interested in seeing if there's anything to do with consciousness, but it's also interesting from a purely mathematical perspective. So they just took the Claude Shannon's classic framework for studying information flow, combined it with this new field called information geometry, which combines insights from information theory and differential geometry, and then use that to derive this really elegant, powerful framework for quantifying information flow in a whole network.
Wow. It seems to be, that's complicated. I mean, you have so many senses. We have a lot of senses, and so you're trying to quantify the data coming in from your eyes, from your ears, from touch. Now, another question. I mean, do you believe that we have just 5 senses? Do you think that we just have those 5 senses, or do you believe that we have other senses that we just kind of haven't discovered yet? or that we don't know how to explain in words?
So we definitely have other senses.
Or what would we call, I mean, do we call them senses? I mean, this is something I've always believed, that we have other senses. There's so many things that we can feel or
Yeah.
without being able to explain them.
Yeah, exactly. Like you have a vestibular sense that's not typically listed
Exactly.
to five.
Yeah. And it's one of the most amazing senses, right? I mean,
Right. Yeah.
and
If
it
you
can be
take
one
yourself-
of the worst, no, when you're, car sick or on a boat or something like that.
Exactly. Well, so actually, I mean, I love to think about this question because if you look at other animals or the animal kingdom in general, there are so many other senses. So I think one of my favorite is electric fish. These fish literally feel perturbations in the electric fields that they generate, and they can communicate through electric pulses in the water. And what is it like to be an electric fish? Or
Like a Morse code. Yeah, that's crazy. I did not know that.
Or a lot of animals can detect gravitational field lines. Even a fly can do this.
Yeah,
and
I've
wolves
heard
don't.
of that actually. I think they have like magnetoreceptors.
So don't quote me on this. I don't know if this is actually right, but I'm fairly sure that we actually have the mechanisms in our eye that would allow us to detect this, like something that responds to magnetism, but our brain isn't receiving this information or isn't interpreting it.
Yeah, it could be like a really old sense that we just haven't exercised. Wow.
Exactly.
Now,
we got rid of it.
On this topic, I wanted to ask you, so humans, we're conscious, but do animals have consciousness? Are animals conscious? This is another deep theoretical question.
So I guess my short answer is that we can't know for sure until we really understand what makes humans conscious. So let's say I finally have a theory of consciousness that I'm like absolutely sure works in humans. Then I can, and it can differentiate conscious humans versus unconscious humans, etc. And then I can apply it to animals, and then I can see what comes up there. But in the absence of such a strong theory, I'm fairly sure that most mammals are conscious. Definitely other apes. The question is, I don't know how far down it goes. I don't know what mechanisms in place. So if you look at a chimp brain and a human brain, they're not fundamentally different. The human brain is about 3 times the size, but the structure is almost identical.
Mm-hmm.
So there's nothing new that we have other than particular connections, I think, which give us language that chimps lack.
Mm-hmm.
But there's no consciousness center in the brain.
Yeah, so it's hard to determine. Yeah, so I guess maybe, like you said, maybe they are conscious, but I guess there's levels to consciousness, right? I mean,
probably
even within humans, there's some people that just seem out of it and not really, receptive to the world. Yeah,
right. We can experience different levels of consciousness.
Exactly, just throughout the day. If you had a coffee or you didn't, or
Exactly. Well, this is why so sleep is really interesting. So anesthesia is the most brute force mechanism. You just turn the whole thing off. But in sleep, there have been experiments where you wake people up during different sleep stages and you ask them, what were you feeling? And there does seem to be gradations of consciousness. So in REM sleep, it's like I was there's a rich sensory world I was just in.
Yeah.
And the deeper you go, the experience seems less and less and less rich. And then when you get to deep sleep, it's not completely blackout like anesthesia is, but people say, I wasn't experiencing anything, but there were these loose thoughts floating around.
Yeah, wow.
Right? So that's definitely a lower level of consciousness, but it's maybe somewhere between REM sleep and anesthesia.
Yeah, sleep is another mystery. We only have theories. We don't really know even why we sleep. Okay, there's the lymphatic system. We need to clean out the brain, blah, blah, blah. But we don't know why, it's just... But we know we have to do it every day. Otherwise, things start to go to shit.
Yeah. I mean, we know it's really important for memory, at least.
Yeah, memory consolidation, I guess there's...
Exactly. But it seems like, if you don't sleep for however number of days, you're going to die. And it's not because of memory, right? So there's clearly other things.
Well, I think before you die, you start to have visual hallucination.
Right, exactly.
And actually, I had a good friend of mine. He went into the military and he some special forces training. He told me they had like was 9 days or something where they 5 hours, 9 days, and he told me that it was one of the strongest hallucinogenic experiences he's had,
Right.
and that it
Yeah,
was powerful.
I actually had that once when I was an undergraduate. I pulled 3 all-nighters in a row. And I was hallucinating computer code.
This
Over
is
the
before
walls
you knew that sleep helped with memory consolidation, right?
before.
Yeah, that's funny. Cool. So you studied what was your undergraduate studies on?
So appropriately, it was philosophy and neuroscience.
Okay,
In my
perfect. Yeah, nice. So using these mathematical models, I'm sure you're using MATLAB or
yeah, yeah,
okay.
yeah,
MATLAB is like
I,
the king of this, right?
yeah.
Yeah, I
I mean,
just started
I,
learning
but I,
recently, and it's pretty cool. It's pretty user friendly. I like it. Um,
yeah, no, it's wonderful. I like that you can actually like see the math that you're working
yeah,
with in that lab.
and the errors too. It's kind of like Word where they, put the red
Exactly.
squiggly line, which helps a lot.
Yeah, it holds your hand a lot.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I wanted to get into altered states of consciousness. Now, you said this is another way I think that we can study consciousness by studying. I know in the US at least, it's starting. I'm not sure the legality of studying drugs like psilocybin and things like that.
Yeah.
Not sure. Do you know more about that? Do you know if it's legal? Do you know if there's are studies being done or?
Yeah, so it's a tricky question. You have some research on this stuff in the U.S., but um, pretty much all of it has to be couched in terms of therapeutic benefits or safety. So
Yeah,
um, you have people studying, MDMA for psychotherapy, etc.
yeah, that's been
One of
out
the
a lot on the news. Yeah,
Yeah, exactly. But you can't really tell a funding agency in the U.S. like, hey, I just want to give people some LSD and see what
yeah,
happens
exactly.
with the experience. But there is a group in London, at the Imperial College London, headed by David Nutt and Robin Card Harris, and they're really big on just giving people psychedelics and seeing how it affects brain activity, how it affects
Studying
perception,
it. Yeah. Now,
thoughts.
I'd be interested to see like a EEG on somebody that's taking one of these drugs. Psilocybin, LSD, something like
Yeah.
that. I don't know if they've
So
done. I'll have to
they've done
research that. They have done that.
Yeah, so there's actually quite interesting. So this actually ties back into the anesthesia conversation. There's this one measure of the complexity of the signal that you can apply to EEG data or MEG data, which is very similar. Um, and people have been using this for about a decade to show that when you're anesthetized, the complexity plummets. And people have kind of known this. Recently, Robin Card Harris in London and his colleagues they applied the same exact complexity measure to MEG data on people. I think this was psilocybin.
Hmm.
And essentially, it was the first time anybody had observed this measure going up.
Wow. So you're
So the brain,
saying, wow, 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 wow. So it does basically the opposite. You're at
yeah,
more a heightened state of consciousness, you could say.
right. I mean, it's difficult to interpret the result.
Yeah,
It's tempting to higher level of consciousness, but ultimately, it's just the brain signal getting more complex. It's not clear what that means.
exactly.
Um, Actually, I was involved in this psychology and neuroscience show called Mindfield, and they did an episode on ayahuasca,
Oh
and we
wow.
got Robin to come, and we recorded the EEG of the host while he was under ayahuasca, and we applied the same analysis to that data, and we found that just like with psilocybin, this complexity measure went up when he was on ayahuasca.
Wow, okay. Well, from my understanding, ayahuasca is very similar to psilocybin chemically. The molecule is
Yeah,
extremely similar. Now, that's crazy. I want to tell you a quick story. About 2 years ago, I went to Peru. I was my dad does a lot of work in Peru and other South America.
mhm,
And we met this ayahuasca shaman, right? And he
yeah,
was explaining us the whole ritual. He had been doing this, probably his whole life, dad or whoever the shaman that taught him how to do it. And he had the bottle in front of us, and he was showing us. He was like, "This is ayahuasca, blah blah blah. We do the, He did the smoke ceremony and all this crazy stuff for us. Obviously, none of us took it because it's crazy. Are you going to trust a random shaman in the middle of the jungle? But
Right.
I remember looking at this guy in the eyes and just kind of analyzing him and being like, it felt like he was on another planet. Like just looking at him. And I was like, this guy is long gone. I could just feel like he probably had done one too many ayahuasca ceremonies.
Right.
And he was kind of like a zombie almost. So,
Right. Oh, maybe he's looking at you and thinking the same thing.
Yeah, probably he's like, this guy knows nothing. Yeah.
Yeah, he hasn't seen what I've seen.
Yeah, exactly. He needs more ayahuasca in his life. Yeah, so I just remember that was my first experience with seeing ayahuasca.
Right.
But,
I mean, it's quite a powerful drug, and it doesn't look like it's a fun time. So in this show that I did, Mindfield, the host kind of said that he learned a lot from it, but that it wasn't fun.
Yeah. Well, and that's the whole thing with these type of drugs. It's like everybody says it can be either amazing or you could have a terrible experience, or it's really hit or miss, I guess, depending on what's going on in your brain. And that's why I think it's difficult to study, because it seems like every person has a varying experience, and depending on their brain chemistry, how they are, their past, their all these things play a huge role. So it's pretty difficult.
That's actually one of the things that this group in London is studying. Like, can you use someone's psychological state, a baseline, to predict how they're going to react to these things?
Yeah, and I think from the top of my head, it sounds like yes. I think you could. You can kind of predict people's reactions or next steps. Now, this brings me to the point that I wanted to ask you about free will. In your opinion, do you think free will exists, or do you think we are more? The other theory argues that we, are just a soup of chemicals. We're affected by our hormones and whether we've eaten or not, or we're affected by all these external factors and internal factors. That kind of free will turns into an illusion. You're gonna eat because your body's sending you messages like eat, we're starving. So, what is your opinion on that?
I get asked this question quite often because I'm a neuroscientist, and I typically say you shouldn't ask a neuroscientist; you should ask a physicist.
Yeah.
Because I think, regardless of what the neural mechanisms of choice end up being, I think that the key question for whether or not free will exists is whether or not we live in a universe in which humans can kind of break out of the causal chain, where we are not caused by anything, and then are these free, uncaused agents which can, create certain effects based on what we desire.
Yeah.
That said, the brain and the mind are so incredibly complicated that even if everything is deterministic, it's this massive chaotic system, and we act in ways that are typically consistent with our beliefs and our intentions. So if we want to zoom out and say, okay, let's say free will doesn't exist, what are the implications of that? And I say, well, we should act as if it does.
Yeah.
Essentially, we're still responsible for our actions because we can still act in a way that is consistent with what we believe.
Exactly. But the question that's do we believe it because we have done it in the past, or because what I wanted to basically get at is that I think, yes, in my opinion, I think free will does exist to an extent. I think is heavily, heavily, heavily influenced by things that we don't really give enough. We don't give them enough credit. I think a lot of things affect us more than. But I think this is a complicated question, I guess. So you were saying that you think we should act as if we did have free will. Now, do you think animals have sort of free will, or do you think they are kind of strictly on autopilot, like I need to eat, pass on my genes and sleep?
Well, I mean, I think they're on autopilot, and so are we.
Yeah, so everybody's on autopilot.
Yeah, because ultimately,
to some extent,
neurons have to obey physics.
Yeah.
And in physics, there's no room for free will. So, yeah, we have a lot of stuff going on in our head, but ultimately it's caused by classic physics.
Yeah. We need to get a physicist. We're gonna get a physicist on, and we'll ask them these questions.
Right.
So, cool. Cool. So, what do you see in the future of your field? What do you think be in 10 years, 20 years? What will we be studying then?
So, my field in terms of neuroscience in general, or my subfield?
Your specific field, I guess, mathematical models, or more systems neuroscience.
So I would love to see a mathematical theory of perception, to really begin to hone in on. So we'll use the neuroscience to say, what is the brain doing when it's awake or not? What is the brain doing when it's perceiving or not? And is there a simple, elegant mathematical framework to describe this? And the reason I want it to be mathematical is because if you express things in terms of math, you can generate predictions. Mm-hmm. You can generate specific predictions, which you can then test. And then you could also begin to build computers that are based off of this. Yeah. Even if we don't want computers to be conscious or not, like, is there any computational mechanism that's served by whatever the brain is doing to integrate these sensory inputs together? Because brains or computers are not integrated at all, like the nervous system is. It's all input-output. Whereas the brain, there's just a lot of stuff kind of swirling inside these networks and things communicating together. And why is it doing that? We don't really know.
So do you think that we will ever create kind of a model of the brain?
I think so. Well, I mean,
eventually.
What you mean by a model? So I
guess mathematical. I mean, mathematical model would be difficult. I read a paper the other day about it was like thalamocortical model.
Yeah.
And it was reading the paper, and they're like, we needed 60 mega computers just to run this, like.
Right.
Because it required so much, power, brute processing power.
Yeah, exactly. So I've been thinking about this question actually a lot recently. I think neuroscience can take an informative cue from physics here. So in physics, for example, if you want to study the movement of a gas through a room, if you wanted to compute the trajectories of every gas molecule, it would be utterly hopeless. You'd have to have so many supercomputers running for so long to compute this. But if you zoom out, you can start to look at the overall statistics of the movement of gas, and this is thermodynamics. And I think there's kind of a similar issue in neuroscience where we're so caught up in the idea that all the relevant action is at the level of single neurons, whereas we know that there's interesting stuff happening when millions of neurons interact. Is there some kind of statistical mechanics of the brain? And I think there is, and I think that people are slowly moving in this direction. So we won't need to model every single neuron on a supercomputer. We can just say, how is a group of neurons acting? How are they interacting? And how does this predict various features of various mental or brain states?
Yeah. And I think that's excellent. I would love to see that too. I mean, the only thing I can see is that it's probably going to be slightly different in each and every one of us based on, especially memories and all everything that we've seen. Our history kind of shapes our neural networks, right? So
100%.
we're gonna have to figure out the median, or something like find the mean of all of them, or it's gonna be an interesting. Yeah, I've heard a lot of people think neuroscientists are kind of just like biologists, but in reality, we have so many computer scientists, hackers, engineers. I'm doing the master with an engineer, and he comes to class with a different mindset, and I think that's excellent. I think we need to combine all of our, like you said, physicists too. I mean, this is how we can really truly advance in the field together. Like you said, neuroscience is huge. There's so many levels to the game. It's awesome. I had another interesting, cool question for you. Has anything that you learned from your research changed the way that you look at your life and kind of live your life?
Oh, that's a great question.
Yeah, that is a good question, right?
So I don't know about. Okay, yeah. So I have like two answers. So one is just from learning about neuroscience in general. it kind of helps me take myself less seriously. I think just to think, oh, I'm this. Well, yeah, no. So I'm an emergent phenomenon from 86 billion neurons, and so are you. Ultimately, we're both just physics. We're a really amazing physical phenomenon, but it kind of helps, not get caught up in our internal narratives as much, and just be like, I'm just cells. Calm down.
It doesn't matter.
Yeah, exactly.
Exactly.
In terms of, so I had very little mathematical background before my PhD.
Yeah, you sound like you've had a lot of mathematical background, I have to tell you.
Yeah, I really didn't. And I was just interested in these neuroscience questions. And then I realized that to really answer them, I needed to learn this math. And so I learned a lot of that. And by doing that, I started to, and I'm not a great mathematician. I can't prove anything for you. But I'm starting to really see the beauty of, like, there's just some deep, deep, deep beauty in mathematics that I now understand what these mathematicians are saying all along. Like, damn, this stuff, the fact that it works, and that you start to see, like, really deep connections between things. So the first time this dawned on me was when I was learning information theory. So in information theory, everything is bound by entropy. So the entropy of a system tells you the maximum information it can carry in bits. But this concept of entropy just pops up in so many places. So one, we know entropy is always increasing, but it's a statistical argument. We also know that the most you can compress any file, it's that lower bound is the entropy of the file. And it can prove all this stuff mathematically. And you begin to think like, and actually this goes back to my research on consciousness. It turns out one of the best predictors of conscious level is the entropy of the brain.
Yeah, wow.
That's amazing. Like, why is this value popping up everywhere?
It's interesting. I never heard it put that way. Yeah, I think that's the beauty of neuroscience, is that you're studying it, but it also, it's so funny. I always see the meme on the internet of like a picture of the brain, and then it's like, the brain, it studies itself. Like the only thing that studies itself. Or another one is like, studies the brain but doesn't understand the brain, or doesn't understand itself.
Right.
I've seen so many funny ones.
The human brain is the most complex thing in the known universe, according to the human brain.
According to exactly that one too. That's a perfect one. But yeah, it's interesting that we're studying basically what our consciousness, just the act of studying consciousness.
So exactly,
You're consciously studying consciousness.
I mean, the thing is, consciousness is sometimes a dirty word in science. So you have to say things like perception or etc. But that's bizarre to me, because consciousness is actually the only thing we know. All of science consciousness is our only lens into the universe.
Exactly.
When we're studying things, it's our consciousness that's noticing these mathematical patterns. It's noting these statistical regularities. Why?
It sounds like one of the most complicated things to study. I mean, you're in there every day. That's awesome. Yeah.
Well, I mean, you can't really. So humanity and science aren't there yet to study consciousness, and so if you're a philosopher, you can spend all day thinking about these really big questions. But what I appreciate about science is that you can spend years developing answers to very, very, very small questions, which you are confident will help humanity in general inch ever closer to answering these big questions.
That's awesome.
I spent 3 years studying information flow in large artificial networks, which had nothing to do with consciousness. But maybe one day it will,
Yeah, exactly. Well, you never know. I wanted to bring up a point. I've heard, obviously, on the Joe Rogan talks about this a lot, about his experience in the, what were they called? Flotation tanks. I don't know if you've heard of these.
Oh, the sensory deprivation.
That's what it is. Now, this is interesting to me. It's kind of related, because he basically, his N=1 experience, basically saying that the fact that you are deprived from your senses allows you to brain to, I guess, work better, or just to see different perspectives on things. And that makes a lot of sense, because your brain is constantly getting bombarded by visual, auditory information, sensory, touching, vibrations. So if you cut all of that out, the question is, what is left? It's not getting bombarded by information. It's kind of just the internal networks firing. And,
Right.
and what happens then? I would personally love to try this one day. I don't know if you anything about experience.
I have not. I've been curious to try it. I have not yet, and I don't
But
know
it makes
anything.
sense, when you as a neuroscientist, you're like, wow, okay, our brains are getting bombarded, constantly by the day, right when we wake up. If you cut all that out, what's left? That's
Yeah, I mean, actually, I've thought about this related question for when we're dreaming, because we know from dreaming that the brain actually doesn't need any input from the outside world to
exactly.
create sensory worlds for you. It's just this internal stuff going on.
Yeah, so this is, so I would love to try this one day, and I've heard great things about it.
Yeah.
That's really interesting. You're right. It's just all internal information, all the internal networks firing, and that's
Yeah.
cool. Well, we'll have to try it sometime. Well, I'm pretty much running out of questions. I don't know if you have anything else you want to talk about.
Um. We covered quite a lot of ground.
We covered a lot of ground, and I'd love to have you on again sometime if you're interested.
Yeah, definitely. This was fun.
Cool. Do you want to plug any, I don't know, social media things or your lab website or anything so that the listeners can see what you're doing or check out your work, or
Yeah,
even
definitely.
contact you or whatever?
So you contacted me through Instagram,
Yep.
which is kind of where I do a lot of my science communication work.
Okay.
So I'm the brain scientist, so the_brain_scientist on Instagram. I'm on Twitter as well, though I don't really use it as much.
Yeah, we're the same way. We don't really like, it's kind of. I think
Yeah.
Instagram is the new Twitter, right?
People are slow. Scientists are so slow to pick it. So right now, scientists are talking about, oh, we should all get on Twitter to do outreach and stuff, and it's already past its prime.
It's already passed. It's like
Too late.
that was so 2 years ago. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, Instagram is I think wonderful for science communication because you can show these beautiful photos, and there's almost unlimited space for what you want to write about it. You can engage with people.
Exactly.
I've met so many amazing people on Instagram.
It's been our best for us. Yeah, we've met we met you. We met amazing people. It's been amazing to stay in touch, to see, the latest news or, what people are doing every day. More like the everyday life is cool to see.
Exactly. And I think it's so important for scientists to show non-scientists the kind of internal workings of life in a lab. What is it? What does it mean to do? What is the process of coming to create new knowledge?
Yeah, I mean,
And
this was our main mission here, at what me and Connor always wanted. We wanted to, we were the young scientists. We wanted to show people, get them inspired and involved and interested in these questions, and to know, look, you can study consciousness, you can study, memory, you can study these things, you can, be at the front line and try to figure out what's going on, and this is awesome. I think it's awesome. I think it's an under glorified field, but we'll see. We're slowly getting more, more ground and expanding. Cool.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna write a small show notes. I don't know if you have anything else. Just brain scientist Instagram. That's it.
Yeah.
Cool.
You want to following updates from lab life and some pretty photos of neurons.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, I've seen your work. It's awesome. Cool. Well, thanks for coming on. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you.